And now we are trying to get security guarantees agreement with the United States, guarantees for Russian people. NATO infrastructure is going closer and closer to our borders, and Ukraine is a direct threat to our security.
Can Britain afford to stand alone against a nuclear superpower? That's the question nobody in government wants to answer after Starmer's humiliating dressing down by Russian leadership on live television yesterday. The confrontation exposed far more than just Starmer's diplomatic inexperience. As allies quietly distance themselves from Britain's increasingly isolated position, Starmer continues pushing rhetoric that Moscow interprets as direct provocation. Why are other NATO countries refusing to echo Starmer's stance on deploying troops? What do they understand about the dangerous game being played that perhaps our Prime Minister doesn't? The answers reveal a troubling reality about Britain's current foreign policy direction.
And as the host of his country's 60 Minutes political news programme, is one of Russia's most famous political faces. I asked him whether his country really does want peace.
It's unacceptable. British troops will be direct target for our missiles. You will get coffins in return.
Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. What happens when a Prime Minister with no foreign policy experience provokes a nuclear superpower? The answer is playing out in real time, and it's far more dangerous than Starmer's team likely anticipated. The diplomatic crisis unfolded when Ivan Popov, a senior MP from Putin's ruling United Russia Party, appeared on Russian state television to deliver what can only be described as a calculated public execution of Starmer's foreign policy credentials.
And now we are trying to get security guarantees agreement with the United States, guarantees for Russian people. NATO infrastructure is going closer and closer to our borders, and Ukraine is a direct threat to our security.
This wasn't just another routine criticism of Western leaders. Popov's calculated performance was designed to make an example of Britain's new Prime Minister on the global stage. With chilling precision, he stated that British troops in Ukraine would become direct targets for our missiles, language that crosses every conceivable diplomatic boundary. Political analysts were stunned by the explicit nature of the threat, noting that while Russian officials often criticize Western leaders, they rarely issue such specific military warnings. The timing wasn't coincidental. Moscow deliberately chose this moment to expose what they perceive as Starmer's complete naivety in international relations. The Russian state media carefully framed the confrontation to portray Starmer as a novice politician dangerously out of his depth on the world stage. Popov's delivery was meticulously crafted, cold, dismissive, and designed to publicly humiliate Britain's leader while signalling Moscow's complete dismissal of UK leadership. But did Starmer actually suggest deploying British troops? Unfortunately for the Prime Minister, the record confirms he indeed floated the idea of British forces serving as peacekeepers in Ukraine, following any potential peace deal. This proposal crossed a red line that Moscow has repeatedly and explicitly warned against. Even the suggestion of British boots on Ukrainian soil was enough to trigger this unprecedented response. What's particularly revealing is how Popov's language deliberately characterised Starmer as an inexperienced politician playing dangerous games with a nuclear power. The Russian MP methodically constructed a narrative of Starmer as someone fundamentally misunderstanding the stakes involved, a devastating portrayal that's nearly impossible to counter once established. The question remains, why target Starmer so specifically? The answer appears to be that Moscow views him as overplaying his hand, attempting to project strength without the necessary backing or understanding of the consequences. Russian officials have concluded that Britain's Prime Minister is dangerously out of his depth, miscalculating Russia's willingness to respond to what they perceive as provocations. While Western leaders routinely face criticism from Russian officials, this explicit missile threat represents a significant and dangerous escalation beyond typical diplomatic tensions. Moscow's missile threat is alarming enough, but perhaps more concerning is what it reveals about Britain's standing among its own allies. As Starmer continues his confrontational approach toward Russia, a troubling diplomatic reality has emerged. Britain stands increasingly alone on the world stage, with traditional NATO partners conspicuously absent in supporting his aggressive stance. This diplomatic isolation isn't accidental. Key allies, including the United States, France, and Germany, have deliberately avoided echoing Starmer's calls for potential troop deployment to Ukraine. Their silence speaks volumes about the credibility gap Starmer has created, potentially leaving the UK exposed in ways not seen since the darkest days of the Cold War. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is how Starmer responded to Russia's public threat. Rather than reassessing his position or seeking to build international consensus, he simply dismissed Russia as the aggressor without addressing the specific missile threat. This tone-deaf response has only deepened the diplomatic chasm between Britain and its traditional partners, who seem unwilling to follow Starmer down this potentially catastrophic path. Military analysts are increasingly alarmed by what appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding on Starmer's part regarding Britain's actual capabilities against a nuclear superpower like Russia. He's creating dangerous expectations that simply cannot be fulfilled given Britain's current military resources. The stark reality is that without international backing, Starmer's confrontational approach leaves the country dangerously exposed. This isolation creates vulnerabilities that extend far beyond mere diplomatic embarrassment. As Britain's influence wanes under Starmer's leadership, economic consequences loom on the horizon. Trade relationships and security cooperation agreements could suffer, further weakening Britain's position at a time when unity among Western nations is paramount. What's particularly striking is how quickly Starmer has managed to transform Britain's international standing. Once respected as a key diplomatic bridge between different world powers, the UK now finds itself increasingly marginalised, a voice that even its closest allies seem reluctant to support. This represents a dramatic and potentially dangerous shift in Britain's geopolitical positioning. The delicate balance between appearing strong and avoiding unnecessary confrontation with a nuclear power requires sophisticated diplomatic skill. Starmer's approach risks tipping this balance into dangerous territory, potentially dragging Britain into a conflict it is neither prepared for nor capable of winning on its own. And while Starmer may believe his hardline stance projects strength, international partners increasingly view it as reckless posturing rather than resoluteness. This diplomatic standoff isn't just embarrassing for Starmer, it's potentially catastrophic for Britain's security. Public opinion polls already show growing unease about his Ukraine stance, with voters overwhelmingly rejecting the notion of deploying British troops into harm's way. Their instincts may be sharper than the Prime Minister's. History offers painful lessons about diplomatic isolation. Britain's previously strained relations with Russia demonstrate how overreaching in foreign policy creates vulnerabilities that last for generations. Starmer seems determined to repeat these mistakes on a grand scale, gambling with national security while the public watches in mounting concern. The uncomfortable question every British citizen should be asking: is this confrontation serving our national interests or merely projecting an image of strength that masks profound weakness? As Russia continues to respond with increasingly explicit threats, Starmer faces a critical choice: recalibrate his approach or continue down this perilous path of isolation and vulnerability. The stakes couldn't be higher,